Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming. Way back when, the old world of Darkness was going strong. Vampire the Masquerade was very popular, as were Werewolf the Apocalypse and Mage the Ascension. So popular even that there are 20th anniversary editions of Vampire coming out this year, Werewolf coming out next year, and no doubt Mage the year after that. Even cancelled books, cancelled because of the Time of Judgment scenario around 10 years ago, just prevented their release from ever happening. They're being released now, so it just goes to show the following, the devout following that some role players have for the old world of Darkness. But I don't want to cover one of those games, I want to cover one of the less popular games. And less popular because it's such a difficult game to get your head around. It's such a difficult game to play in some ways, and that game is Wraith The Oblivion. A game that is for mature players and mature storytellers, not because it's Black Dog, not because it deals with pornography, extreme violence and nasty words by any means. It is a game of very mature themes, specifically death and how to deal with death in a role-playing game. Because in Wraith you play someone who is dead. You play someone who has passed on but has not settled all of his scores. Maybe he has an enemy in the Skinlands that he hasn't vanquished yet. Maybe he has a loved one who he needs to protect. Maybe he has unrequited love that he still needs to settle that. Maybe he has a son who he doesn't want to follow in his footsteps. Maybe he has a possession that he needs to get from one place to another. Maybe he has a mission that he just never got round to completing. Whatever the case, the Wraith is unable to move on to his final resting place, and so he is trapped in the Shadowlands, maybe sometimes able to visit the Skinlands in order to further his goal. And the trials and tribulations of a Wraith are manifold. You have fellow Wraiths, of course, the slave trade being very strong in the Shadowlands, as the only material currency are the souls of others. So you've got slavers, reapers, who take Wraiths as soon as people die. They will take the Wraiths and hammer that ectoplasm down into coins and other materials. The only other material being relics, very equipment, basically objects of great importance in the Skinlands and the Shadowlands, that they become manifest in the Shadowlands as well, as solid items. And not only that, you have mortal exorcists, of course, who may preach that they want to free you, pass you on to your final resting place, but what they're actually doing is sending you to oblivion. Oblivion being that worst state that I will cover quite soon. You also have the Giovanni clan of vampires, who are a very despicable clan of necromancer vampires who do have a tendency of threatening Wraith's fetters, those things that attach them to the Skinlands, unless the Wraith will serve them. So a Wraith has many enemies, both among their own number. If you're a member of the hierarchy, the de facto rulership of Wraith society, then you may find yourself an enemy of the renegades, independent Wraiths who wish to strike out on their own, or the heretics, Wraiths who cling so fervently to their religions from the Skinlands that they believe that their destiny awaits them on the far shores across the roiling tempests of souls that go between the necropoli, the Shadowlands versions of cities in the Skinlands. Wraiths do not have it easy by any means. Wraiths have it very difficult indeed, because the problem that players have, the problem that some storytellers have, is what purpose do I have in this game? If my ultimate objective is to pass on, which it is, you have two choices essentially. You either linger in the Shadowlands for generations, and you can do that. Many Wraiths have been around for thousands of years, or well, more hundreds than thousands. Others wish to transcend. Transcendence is the ultimate goal. It's the goal where you settle your fetters, you settle all of your unfinished business, you reach a balanced harmony with your own shadow, your dark spirit, and you pass on to whatever final fate awaits you. The last and worst option is oblivion. Oblivion being exactly what it says. When your shadow takes over your soul, when your dark side completely dominates you, and you are driven into absolute nothingness. When you consider that you have already witnessed death because you have already experienced it, and how scary a prospect that must have been. How much scarier is the idea of not existing at all, being ripped apart to form up the ever-increasing oblivion, the oblivion of spectres that is rising up, ready to take away all of the necropoli in the Shadowlands in a maelstrom of hate. It is something to fear for a Wraith, and the idea of a shadow, the idea of being split down the middle, you have your wraith with your human mores, and you have your shadow. And your shadow in the game will, or should, be played by another player, or even the storyteller if push comes to shove, but it should be another player. And what you will then have is each player will play the player to his right, let's say, shadow, your dark id, who will tempt you and cajole you and try and get you to do things that aren't necessarily morally correct. That doesn't mean they're not the right option all the time, or the wrong option all the time, but it does mean that they're trying to drive you closer and closer to oblivion. And you have to have mature players to do this, because most role players would say, no, I'm just going to do absolutely the opposite to everything the shadow wants. But the shadow wants to survive in some cases, and wants to be very malignant indeed. So sometimes the shadow's option is the better option. Problem is, if you give in to the shadow too often, you'll become a spectre, a ravenous wraith of very little sentience indeed, that just wants to destroy other wraiths and serve oblivion. And the only thing that the renegades, the hierarchy, and the heretics are united on is opposing oblivion completely. And that means the worst foe of a wraith is himself, the shadow that's within himself, the malign force within himself. And whether you can reach transcendence or not is a very difficult goal to reach. And as I say, it puts a lot of people off of this game, because it makes it a game. It's not a game where you can just get a certain amount of gold or a certain amount of experience or reach a certain position in politics and say, I've won. It's not a game where you can have a tangible ending. The ending is being at peace. And so you can have very interesting games where, while the victory may seem sour, from an introspective point of view, it can be truly fantastic. If you think about it, if you actually think about the character you're playing, you will rarely play a game more deep, more introspective than a game like Wraith, because while I say Wraith is a game about death and about dying, about unsettled scores, it's a game about valuing life, valuing the life that you had, the loved ones that you left behind, the unfinished business that you have. It allows you to see life through the eyes of the dead. You can see mortals walking around in the Skinlands in increasing states of decomposition, because you can see how close they are to dying. You may want to hang around in the Shadowlands even though your fetters are being settled, because you want to make sure that when your families die, they aren't taken by the Reapers, and so you will persist constantly, because you never want to let your loved ones go. So it's a game of great emotion. It's a game that some people can't handle the emotion of, because it can be a very morbid game, but at the same time it can be a very hopeful game. When you consider that as a wraith you are peering into the world of the living and seeing all that you have lost, you can't ever get it back, you can't ever come back to life. That's not the point of Wraith, and if it was, I think it would be a very shallow game. What you are potentially trying to do is trying to protect your loved ones in a way that they will never acknowledge, that they will never understand. If they ever witnessed you, they will be absolutely terrified of you, more likely than not. So it means you have to play the game in very subtle ways. So this is where your arcanos, or your arcanos, comes into effect. The disciplines of Wraith, essentially. You can use things like phantasm to penetrate the dreams of mortals and affect them in whatever way you want. You can use puppetry in the way that it's quite obvious. Embody allows you to actually appear, manifest in an apparitional kind of way into the Skinlands. You have fatalism that allows you to get even closer looks at the mortal thread of those walking around in the Skinlands. And just to name some of the other arcanos, you can control their emotions with things like outrage. You can invoke senses of weirdness, the likes of which that Brady of 23 Penguins 32 was talking about with his farmhouse expedition the other day. You can make places thoroughly unsettling. So while you could be protecting people, you could also be frightening people away from your haunts, because wraiths don't just have fetters that might be people, possessions, places, missions. That you can have a haunt, a place where you are at your strongest in the Skinlands, and you can frighten people away. You could be a poltergeist and control things and throw things at people. And the reason I point these things out, usually I don't go into depth on the abilities and what they do, is because everything you ever heard about in a ghost story, whether mythology or not. It depends on whether you believe in the paranormal, and personally I'm a thorough skeptic, but these abilities are evoke such thought, such imagination. When I ran Wraith recently, the players really got into using their abilities, really got into just frightening the mortals they were trying to, and they could just call upon memory, upon all the films they had watched with ghost stories in, and every single one of those abilities is catered for in Wraith The Oblivion. So, what haven't I mentioned? The system, D10 storyteller system. If you're not familiar with it, it's a point-buy system for character generation, and you roll a D10 for every point you have in a stat. So, for instance, let's say you want to stealthily move somewhere, dexterity plus stealth, let's say you've got 6 points in total, you roll 6d10. If you roll, let's say, 6 or above, because it's a standard difficulty, that's a success for each 6 or above. If you roll a 1, that cancels out each success. If you end up with more 1s than you have successes, it's a critical failure. The character generation in Wraith is probably the most important thing, and one of the things that puts a lot of people off of this game, because in most games you come up with a character concept and you know that you will play it through to the very end of the game. You will advance, you will evolve, your character will gain more and more motivations as time goes on. If I show you what you have to do in Wraith, you obviously have your character sheet here, and you have your shadows character sheet as well. You will make a shadow for your Wraith, but you also have, and this is quite unique, a death certificate that lists your cause of death, the description of your death, any distinguishing marks or features. Basically, it's the coroner's report on your body. And as soon as I saw this for the first time, I thought, wow, I can come up with so many ideas just by filling in a death certificate for a character. But the most important thing is you need to make a fully fleshed out character, and that's the most difficult thing. Whether you're reading a novel or playing a game, it's very rare for a character's motivations, everything about him, his life, his loves, his enemies, his job, everything to be fleshed out from the start. The character you make in Wraith needs to be a fully functioning, fully fleshed out human being. That is quite a big ask for some players, and I don't blame them for being intimidated for that, because you are playing a man or woman who has essentially lived a life for the most part. Even if you're a child, you have still lived a life. You're not a blank slate that's willing to go on an adventure. You are looking back at what your life was and what you have left behind. I understand why some people think this is a depressing thing. This is a depressing game. But as I say, this isn't just a game about death. It's a game about life. It's a game about examining life and seeing how important it is, valuing it, looking after it, taking care of it, letting go of any of your regrets and settling any problems, any scores you may have, whether it's through forgiveness or through revenge. And you can see how the human moors fall on one side of the fence and the spectre, the shadow, will fall on the other. You need mature, reliable gamers for this, because if you've got the player next to you playing your shadow and the player next to him playing his shadow and so on around the table, you need players who will turn up to every session. Otherwise you may well end up having no one to play your shadow, or someone playing two shadows, which will be quite difficult to control. And you will also need to be able to talk to your players and your storyteller about your character, about everything that you can think of about your character, so that the shadow can be played properly. Now, the shadow can propose things or mention things in your character's past that you may not have considered, and you can of course accept them and incorporate them, or alternatively you can let the shadow have free reign. But like I say, you need mature players who won't just derail things for the sake of, well, just a laugh. This game is quite a serious game. There's political aspects, there's emotional aspects, there's the sheer power aspect of being a very powerful spirit that is practically immortal unless you succumb to oblivion, and essentially that's about it. The artwork in the game is typical Tim Bradstreet, John Cobb, Ken Mayer Jr., and as usual their art is very good in White Wolf products. I recommend it. It's very evocative, as a word I've already used in this review, and I cannot recommend this game enough. It's an artistic achievement. It's a shame more people haven't played it, but I do understand why. It's a very difficult game to get your head around, but just pick it up. It's out of print, but find it, read it, enjoy it, appreciate it. This game is the closest role-playing game you will get to art. Thank you.